Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sam Galler. I'm a DPhil student in International Development. My pictures are not as cool as Magdalen's, and my colors aren't as beautifully coordinated as Ellie's. But I hope you'll forgive me. My DPhil topic is in the Department of International Development. I'm looking at a specific type of organization that is what I'm arguing is a new phenomenon in China, and that can teach us a lot about the way that we study organizations in general. So this is fitting into the organizational sociology tradition. I'm looking at institutions, which are the cultural and societal forces that act upon organizations and affect the way that they develop. But I'm also looking at pieces within organizations, which are the sort of mechanisms that organizations use to develop themselves. So this fits into a broader discussion of both NGOs and firms, and I'll get to that. I'm wary of time, so I'm going to breeze through some of these slides. I'm asking questions about the particular environment of the Chinese civil sector, which is the political and financial forces that act on NGOs that work on HIV in China. I've studied HIV organizations in China for now the last 4 years, and I'm quite familiar with this particular group of civil activists and small groups that are acting in a number of ways to provide services related to HIV. HIV in China is not as prevalent as it is in many other areas in the world, including the US actually, on a population scale. But in certain areas in China, there are very high rates of infection. And these have to do with the history of privatizing the healthcare system, which led to hospitals purchasing blood from rural areas and secondary markets coming up where people were sort of collecting blood for hospitals and not testing it, and then there were entire villages that were affected at very high prevalence rates. But it also has to do with drug trades coming from Southeast Asia up through China, and of course people traveling through China from other countries and infecting Chinese people through sexual intercourse and drug use. So there's a very interesting history of HIV that this is embedded in. But the questions I'm asking are basically how these organizations are reacting to those problems and how they're developing different institutions to sort of provide services and deal with that. So my focus is on the assembly of these, what I'm calling hybrid organizations, which are organizations that are in the civil sector, meaning they're NGOs, but they're also incorporating market mechanisms. And this is something that has only really occurred in the last 5 or 10 years. But that's something that is echoed in a lot of other countries in the world. For instance, the School Forum, there's a lot of interest in social enterprise. There's a lot of interest in market mechanisms for development, and these organizations fit into those conversations. They really are, and I'll go through a number of case studies, but they really are somewhat unclassifiable in that they do collect revenue. They're registered maybe as an NGO, maybe not registered at all, maybe as a firm, but they act under multiple identities. So, like I said before, I'm looking at organizations. I'm looking at what's called an organizational set, which is a group of organizations that all have a similar characteristic. They're working on HIV, and they would self-declare as a community-based organization, means they are acting on behalf of a community of people. In this case, it's a marginalized community that intersects with a number of other identities, such as gay men, drug users, sex workers, and people living in rural areas. And so these communities often are economically disadvantaged. They are not well organized. And in the particular Chinese context, the idea of doing something in the civil sector, of starting an NGO or working for an NGO, is also quite stigmatized. There's a big lack of trust for those sorts of organizations. And so this set of organizations actually connects to a large network of other types of organizations, including international aid donors, private sector donors within China, companies, governments, hospitals, clinics, the communities they work with, and then other NGOs that they're partnering with. And so I've interviewed mostly these groups, but also some of the other actors that are related to what they do. And so there are 3 sort of units of analysis on which I'm working. One of them is what I call intra-organizational, which means the pieces of organizations. This is the staff people, the departments into which they're divided, and the different ways in which they delineate themselves. So they might have, for instance, in a typical bureaucracy, you might have a marketing group, you might have an operations group, some group that's responsible for production, etc. And so in these organizations, they're very, very small, and often 5 staff or fewer. So they're much simpler than the other organizations that sociologists study, for instance, like large multinational companies, but they still have very market structures that fit into the discussions about bureaucratization. They fit into discussions about management and how the people designing their organizations are actually actively reshaping them all the time. There's also this idea of loose coupling, which describes the way that different pieces of an organization either work very closely together or not very closely together. And then by measuring that, we can learn a lot about the way that organizations are reacting to their environments. There's other things that I'm looking at about the way that they specialize, the way that individual staff members are asked to take care of certain types of tasks, and the way that decisions are made throughout an organization that has multiple people in it, reacting to many, many different forces, including news events, including political changes in policy toward NGOs, and registering NGOs, grant making, etc. There's also the interorganizational level, which means that as an NGO, these organizations are interfacing with their embassies, grant-making organizations, other NGOs, and government sort of relevant departments. In China, there's an interesting, I could talk about this as well, but there's a dual registration system, which makes it quite complicated for NGOs to register. They have to be registered with both the civil affairs and the relevant department. So, and then lastly, there's this institutional level, which looks at the different sets of meanings that these organizations are operating within. Some of them are shaping the organization, some of them are acting on the people in the organization. Okay, I'm going to go through this very quickly. Yeah, so I guess I'll just conclude and say this research is asking a very specific sociological question, but it also is looking at processes of building organizations. And in this case, these organizations that are both in the private sector and the public sector are promising examples for development interventions in other countries and in China. And they're also sort of interesting studies that act in dialogue with the preconceived notions that we have about the ways that organizations are built, which are, if you look at the history of organizational sociology, almost entirely established by studying organizations in the US and in Europe. So, thank you.